Hello everyone, welcome to Keen Ear. So for this video I wanted to focus entirely on a very special type of album, which is the double album. And I guess what makes the double album so special, besides the obvious of course of it being just a rarer beast I suppose than the single disc record. It kind of runs much deeper than that though. It's much more significant than that because as somebody who collects records and albums and that kind of thing, it really does signpost. A double album does signpost of an artist or a group's discography. Something that is at the very least worth checking out, because a double album is it can at least represent the peak of what an artist or a group are capable of, really, or at least a high point in their musical career. For instance, you very seldom ever hear anybody who's talking about an artist or a group's best and worst albums, in a ranking video here on YouTube, or a magazine article, or wherever, on a website. You very, very rarely ever see a double album at the very bottom or near the bottom. They always tend to be higher up, and I think that kind of it does highlight the fact that double albums, they are a bit special. They have more kind of effort pour into them. They have more creativity pour into them. They have a little bit more experimentation maybe in certain cases. If you think of the Beatles, for instance, the White Album, probably the most famous double album ever made. You know, if you were around in the 60s, or indeed any time, any time, prior to then, when you started off with the first few albums and you're working your way through all their albums, and all of a sudden, a double album pops up. It's like it's a much bigger sort of scope, really. It's a much sort of wider, depth of field to a certain extent. You kind of seen a bigger picture. It's no longer a 40-minute long or whatever release. It's a much bigger expanse, and you kind of it allows them to experiment more, do something a bit different, and that kind of thing. And not always the case, of course, but it does allow that. There is space to do these extra things and to do things a little bit differently, I suppose. And I think that's what's so special about them, really. It really is just like a signpost. It's like a homing missile, of an album that's worth checking out and looking into. And generally they do tend to be something special. And a double album done great, done the right way, and done given the right amounts of treatment, can be something truly special and truly, and truly great, well worth checking out. So what I want to talk about first and foremost really is, what is a proper double album? Because, and that may sound like a really stupid thing to say, I know, but what complicates it really is the CD era, because when the CD era started, which I believe was around 86, 87, when CDs overtook vinyl for the first time ever, it really did change everything. It changed the whole dynamics of albums, and how albums were released and how they were created. Because for the first time ever, really, artists were no longer restricted by the limitations of vinyl. Effectively, they could release an album that's much longer, and can fit a lot more material on it, and they didn't have such you know a, an issue with that happening. The record labels weren't kind of pushing against that idea. They were more accepting of it in many ways, because it didn't really impact sales and that kind of thing. It didn't really hurt profits, so they kind of were easy with it. So and it was less of a risk as well. So there's that aspect, and I guess that's part of the reason why double albums, generally do seem to be pretty good as well, because there's a lot more riding on them. And if a double album flops, it'll flop harder, and it'll hemorrhage more money, and and even if a double album is successful, it generally, they don't generate as much money as a single album, because they are that much more expensive. So they really are a statement of intent. They really are a push, and they are definitely more of a creative push than a commercial push, and that sort of thing. So it really is something that's well worth checking out. It's worth the extra investment. You do seem to be getting, you are paying more for something, but you do seem to be getting a lot more in return as well. So it's kind of give and take, I suppose. And you could also as well argue with vinyl. When vinyl was the dominant factor, in a dominant sort of format, that it acted almost like in many ways like a quality assurance thing, and that sort of thing. When it comes to albums, because you can only fit so many songs on a vinyl disc before the audio goes to crap. So you had to cut out certain tracks to make it all fit effectively. But then again, you could also argue the opposite. On that sort of note, you can go the opposite way and say, well, maybe some of the best albums that have ever been made, pre, the CD era could have been maybe even better if they could have added two, three, four, five extra tracks. Who knows? So it kind of works both ways as well, I suppose. So yeah, it really was a big change of time, and it really was a real I guess a liberator to a certain extent, for musicians, they could just push things a little bit further. And I think the group that really typifies what I'm talking about really is the Rolling Stones, because the Rolling Stones in the 60s, when they formed up until say the year 1990, they only released one, double studio album. And then from 1990 onwards, to this very day, they have only released double albums, and that's because the focus has very much switched for the Rolling Stones. They no longer had a 40-minute record in mind, because they were effectively keeping up with the times. The technology and music had sort of changed. The music industry had changed, and they were following. It wasn't necessarily a creative choice all that much. It was more like, oh, we don't have to release 40-minute long albums now. We can go for much longer, and it's not necessarily such a problem. So we'll do it. So yeah, all their albums from you know the 1990, as I said, and onwards have all been all been double albums. Have all been big, and it's not like they're the only ones. Many other albums from the CD era have been and in many cases as well, they haven't really been proper double albums either. They've been maybe a bit too long for a single album, but maybe a bit too short for a double. So you kind of get that, but it fits perfectly on a CD, so all is fine. And that's kind of the issue that I have with a lot of these albums, particularly from 1990 onwards, them not being really proper double albums, because the more albums with the intention of them being on CD rather than vinyl, like they had been earlier. It was no longer, it was almost like a paradox in a certain way that, you know, double albums, they became almost obsolete. They became something that wasn't necessarily important or special anymore, and they kind of became almost extinct as a result of that. But at the same time, they became very, very common, and it was like in terms of the Rolling Stones, they only released double albums, from the 1990s onwards. So it's a strange state of affairs and a real paradox, one hand dying away and on the other hand being really, really common and being everywhere in a certain extent. Well, that's mainly because of the CD. CD was the main focus, and then after that, it was downloads and everything like that. But the CD really changed everything, really changed the dynamics of the double album. So the albums we're going to be looking at really in this video, they're all pre 1990. They're all proper double albums, as I feel. That's what they are, rather than CD albums that have been put onto vinyl effectively. So we'll start off with the big boy of the double album. It's the White Album. Of course, I had to include the White Album. And yeah, this is the best double album ever created, as far as I'm concerned. It's I've got no idea whatsoever what's the best single album ever made, but in terms of doubles, this is the one to beat really. And the Beatles never invented the double album, but they kind of showed what was possible with it really, and it allowed them to experiment a lot more and do different things and get away with things probably that they wouldn't have been able to get away with on a single disc release. So yeah, very important album, the best double album ever, as I've said. And yeah, really the one double album that everybody really should at the very least listen to at least once, or own a copy of. In the same year, the Jimi Hendrix Experience released Electric Ladyland. So yeah, 1968, pretty much the best year of all time for double albums. And I'd say that you know the White Album's probably the best album ever, double album ever made. This is probably the second best. This is a great double album. Every time I listen to this, I always feel like it's Jimi Hendrix kind of warming up, and yet the best, the best is maybe yet to come with us, in the future. But yeah, this is still an amazing album. It really does make you think, how great Jimmy could have been if we made like a follow up to this, Electric Ladyland 2 maybe in sometime in the 70s, but we never really, unfortunately, got that. So yeah, but we did get that, and it's fantastic. So moving on now to Physical Graffiti, Led Zeppelin. Yeah, these are all like the cornerstones really of the double albums. This is a great one. I believe this started out as a single disc release, and then over time they decided to make it a double. They had some extra tracks in reserve, in the sort of in the back lot, I suppose, and they put them on this, made it a double, and it's great. It's got some, it's a bit more progressive rock than other Led Zeppelin albums, which is very popular at this time, in the mid 70s. And you kind of get the sense as well, of course, that it's made up of odds and ends to a certain degree, and it's got a track on it called "Houses of the Holy," which of course is the title of the previous album. It really probably should have been on their earlier album, but ends its way up on here. So yeah, it's kind of a bit of a mongrel album to a certain degree, but it's a very fine mongrel album, and I kind of wouldn't change anything about it. And it works very well. Lovely different amounts of styles. Quite a versatile album for Led Zeppelin, who aren't necessarily the most versatile group of all time, shall we say? But yeah, I really do like it. And probably the last great, truly great Led Zeppelin album as well. Kind of the end of an era for them, I suppose. Next, we got Rolling Stones. Anyone who's regularly watched my videos, about the sick of hearing about the Rolling Stones, really, I'm sick of seeing this album. I've kind of been showing her a lot recently, but I had to show this. It is my favorite Rolling Stones album. It is one of the best albums ever made, as far as I'm concerned, and it was an album really that the Stones kind of had to pour out. The Beatles had already put out a double album. And where the Beatles go, the Stones tend to follow. And I'm kind of, glad that they probably, they could have put one out in the 60s, during the Brian Jones era. Kind of glad maybe they held on, to the 70s, and just didn't rush into doing it really, just didn't do it like in '69 or whatever, a year after the White Album or whatever. But they waited a bit, and I think they waited long enough really to do this, and it's kind of like the last. It's a tail end of the peak really of the Rolling Stones. I think the peak started about '66 for the Stones, and it kind of trailed off by '73. And this is I think this is the accumulation of the peak really. Fine album, and if you maybe only ever listened to this album once or twice and you didn't really get into it, I kind of urge you to give it more time. It's an album that requires a bit of dedication, and then once the penny drops with it, it's a fantastic album. It truly is. So we'll move on now to Genesis. Nothing by Phil Collins or anything like that, but it's the Genesis as far as double albums go. This is Blonde on Blonde by Dylan, first double album ever made, and yeah, fantastic album. This is a real treat because this is the Dylan era and sound that I kind of like the most, really. The sort of rocky, folky sort of, Dylan, the more electric guitar based Dylan. And it's a double album as well, so you get a lot of it. And it was released, I believe, at a time when Dylan was on good form. He's creating a lot of music. He was really just creating track after track after track. He was a bit of a songwriting machine at this time, which is exactly what you want. You got some of these good writing music as Bob Dylan, and there are a bit of a peak as well. So it's kind of like a match made in heaven, really. So you get this, and it's just a great album. Right? That's something that I haven't really listened to a great deal. I haven't had this very long, but yeah, it's a special album. So yeah, a good entry, to the double albums. The first one in terms of pop and rock, anyway, ever created, and he did an amazing job with it, really. And it kind of, I believe, it happened largely by sort of it was just one of those things that happened. He had so many songs, and the label wasn't too sure what to do with it, so they just thought, we'll just put it out as a double. Didn't really, I guess, put too much thought into it. Didn't really think about it too much because he was doing quite well at the time. His records were selling, so they thought, yeah, we'll just do a double, and it just kind of happened. It was somewhat organic, I guess. I think that's maybe what's so good about it, really. So move on now to Stevie Wonder, and this is Songs from the Key of Life. Now this one's a little bit of a cheat, I suppose, because if you want to be really sort of anal about things, because it's a double plus a 45 as well, so it's a little bit more than the double. There's the 45 here. So yeah, it's almost like Stevie put out a CD album. I was speaking before about CD albums. This is a little bit longer than a double, because it's got this extra 45 with it. And yeah, but only the thing is, this came out in '76, so yeah, it's way ahead of its time, I guess. The CD was nowhere near hitting the shelves at this point in time. So yeah, I can only assume Stevie Wonder has access to a time machine. This is the evidence of it, really. But yeah, again, similar to Blonde on Blonde, this is Stevie on a pretty high point in his creative abilities, and he's putting out, again, he's becoming a bit of a songwriting machine. He's just created this double album, and it's almost like it's not enough for him, And I think if Stevie had access, if CDs were around in '76, or if we all had access to CDs and not just Stevie Wonder and his time machine, we could have had quite amazing albums at this point in time. So it's like he was creating too much. At this point, he's just too creative, I suppose, which is kind of a bit annoying to a certain extent. We get people who are just too creative. I couldn't write a song to save me life, so yeah, it's a bit annoying in that sense. Now we'll take a look at some albums by Prince, and these are like the very last really true sort of double albums. We've got Sign of the Times, one of the best double albums ever. 1987, fantastic album. Really, this is kind of like the end of the era, I suppose. This is when CDs were just starting to take over, and vinyl was starting to lose its foothold really on the market, really. And from this point on, artists will be kind of rounded up by the studio executives and saying, and told, you're going to start making albums for CDs now rather than vinyl. So it was kind of the end of the era, I suppose, with this, and it's a fine album. And many consider this to be, Prince's best, and it kind of, it started with Blonde on Blonde, and I think it kind of ends really with Prince Sign of the Times, which is kind of it's quite a political album, so it's kind of a coincidence that that's the case because Bob was very political, of course. So we'll move on to another Prince album, 1999, and this is a fairly lightweight album. In all honesty, it's a bit of a party album. This I always feel like. Well, it's a fine release. And yeah, one again from the '80s, so one of the latter sort of true double albums, and it's a lot of fun as well, I suppose. So yeah, Prince 1999. I had to include that. The last one I'm going to be showing is ELO's Out of the Blue. So yeah, we'll kind of wrap her up now. One of the last things I want to talk about really is before I reveal what I consider to be the worst double album ever conceived is just talk about groups and artists who in their peak never released a double album. And the first and foremost is Queen. It's kind of amazing that Queen in the 1970s released a double album. They released one arguably later on, and that kind of thing, Made in Heaven or whatever, which is a pretty crappy Queen album in all honesty. But in terms of the '70s, they never put out a double album. I always feel like A Night at the Opera should have been a double album. That was something particularly special. If they'd have done it, a double album, maybe merged together A Night at the Opera as it was with A Day at the Races, I think that would have been fantastic. But then again, there is some weaker tracks on A Day at the Races, which may have just watered it down a little bit. But then again, it is supposed to be like a night at the opera, in a big epic, and operas of course are very long, so I think it would have fit very well as a double, but it wasn't to be. I also think like something like Jazz or maybe uh, News of the World, put those two albums together. I think that would have been a pretty good double album as well. One of the most versatile albums ever made, or probably ever will be. If that would have been the case, then that would have been pretty special. So yeah, we didn't really get one from Queen in their peak. Also, we didn't get one from Bowie in his peak either. We got them in the '90s and that kind of thing with those CD-based albums. But in terms of the 1970s, we never really got one. It would have been good to maybe get maybe Low and Heroes and put them together and make a double. Or maybe I always think possibly you know, Young Americans with Station to Station. I think that could have possibly made quite an interesting double album as well. But again, it wasn't really to be. I guess because Bowie and Queen this time they were releasing albums pretty much every year. So for them to put out a double album as well is kind of asking a lot. Only the Beatles were really capable of putting out album after album after album and then put out a double and then keep going really to a certain extent anyway. So yeah, Queen and Bowie, I think, are the two big ones that spring to mind. So yeah, I'll kind of wrap this video up. I just want to mention how I think is to be the worst double album, particularly the worst album I've ever heard, and it's from Lou Reed and it's called Metal Machine Music, I believe it's called, which is it's a double album made up entirely of guitar based feedback, feedback noise effectively. And yeah, I can't believe anybody actually likes that album. I've tried listening to it, and it's almost like torture in a way. Listening to it really is. It's if you think the current day pop music is bad, try listening to Lou Reed's Metal Machine music. It's easily the worst double album ever made, and it's probably one of the worst album ever made in the history of music. Really, it really is. It begs belief. So yeah, check that album out if you've never really listened to it before. It really is a mind blower, and I could only imagine the amount of disappointment people had going out and buying it and checking it out for the first time, before the internet or anything like that, expecting Lou Reed to be playing pop songs and that kind of thing, and they just get the screeching sound for 90 odd minutes or whatever, and it's just that it doesn't change, it doesn't stop, it's relentless. So that'll do for this video, I'm sure. I'm not too sure if this is going to be the last one till Christmas. It could well be Christmas Day. So Merry Christmas, everyone who's watching this video, and see you probably in 2022, I believe. Is that the one we're going for this time? So thanks for everyone. Bye bye.